There was a stand near the Silesian station in Berlin where a heavy-set man sold sausages and smoked meat. And in the winter of 1919, in a city where actual meat had become almost a memory, that stand was one of the most popular things on the whole street. Picture it before you know anything else. The griddle hissing, the smoke curling up into the cold air and catching the gas lamps. A queue of tired people, dock workers and railway, men and women coming off a night shift, coins in their hands, waiting their turn for something hot and filling in a city that had almost nothing hot or filling left to offer. The man behind the stand was known to the regulars. He was heavy-set, unremarkable, the sort of face you would pass 100 times and never once think to look at twice. He undercut the official prices. Nobody asked him how. In a starving city, a man who can sell you meat you can actually afford is not questioned. He is thanked. Hold that stand in your mind, the smoke and the queue and the grateful customers, because it will not stay an innocent picture for very much longer. Tonight we revisit one case that grew in the telling into something almost too enormous to be believed. And that is exactly why it still will not let go of the imagination a century later. One city starving, one man moving through its darkest edges for years without a name, one arrest that turned an ordinary Berlin apartment into one of the most horrifying crime scenes of the century. The case of Karl Grossmann begins in Berlin, in the district of Friedrichshain, in the years immediately following the First World War. To understand what made this man possible, you first have to understand the city that surrounded him. Because Grossmann did not operate in secret, so much as he operated inside a catastrophe that gave him cover. Germany had lost the war in November of 1918, and the peace that followed did not bring relief. It brought collapse. The wartime blockade had already starved the country for years, and in its aftermath Berlin was a capital of hunger, its currency sliding toward worthlessness, its streets full of demobilized soldiers with no trades and no prospects, its railway stations crowded with a new and desperate population, refugees and displaced women pouring in from the lost eastern territories and the collapsing edges of the old empire, all of them looking for the same two things: work and food. Meat, in particular, had become close to a fantasy for the ordinary Berliner. Ration cards promised portions that the shops frequently could not supply at all. A butcher who could be relied upon, who kept his prices low and his shelves stocked, was treated less like a tradesman and more like a small miracle. Berlin in those years was also a city that had briefly torn itself apart from the inside. In January of 1919, only weeks after the armistice, the Spartacist uprising had turned the streets of the capital into a battlefield between revolutionary workers and the paramilitary forces sent to crush them, and the fighting left corpses in the same squares and along the same canals where ordinary Berliners did their shopping. The police, who might, in a calmer decade, have built a slow and careful case against a quiet man near the Silesian station, were the same police occupied with street barricades, political assassinations, and a homicide rate driven by ideology as much as by greed or lust. A missing prostitute or a nameless migrant woman was in that specific year competing for investigative attention against corpses that came with political consequences attached. She did not stand a chance of being noticed. This was the precise weather in which a predator like Grossmann could operate for years with almost no fear of discovery, not because the danger he posed was subtle, but because the entire apparatus meant to notice him was looking somewhere else, at fires the state itself judged more urgent. Into this hunger stepped Karl Grossmann. He had trained, years before, as a butcher's apprentice, and whatever else the war and the years had done to him, they had not taken that particular skill away. He lived in the slums that clustered around the Schlesische Bahnhof, the Silesian station, one of the great teeming rail termini of the city, a place where trains disgorged thousands of exhausted travelers every day, and where a predator with patience could simply stand and watch the tide come in. Grossmann rented a squalid upstairs flat with its own separate entrance, the kind of arrangement that let him bring people up and down without a single neighbor ever needing to see who came and who did not come down again. By every account, he paid his rent on time. He was, to the landlord, a model tenant. He was not, to the authorities, an unknown quantity. Long before the horror near the Silesian station, Grossmann had already passed through the hands of the law more than once, convicted on separate occasions of offenses against children, a documented history of predatory and sadistic conduct stretching back years. This is one of the details that ought to trouble anyone who studies this case as much as the murders themselves. The state already had a file on this man. It already had, on paper, cause to watch him. And in the specific chaos of a defeated, starving Germany, where the machinery of ordinary policing had been stripped down to almost nothing by 4 years of war and a revolution besides, a documented history of exactly this kind of danger simply sat in a drawer somewhere, unconnected to the disappearances beginning to accumulate a few streets away. A functioning state, even a modestly functioning one, tracks a man with that record. The Berlin of 1919 could not spare the attention. I want you to understand exactly who Grossmann was looking for among that flood of desperate arrivals at the station, because the choice was not random, and it tells you everything about how this went unnoticed for as long as it did. He did not target the well-connected. He did not target women with families waiting for them, or employers expecting them, or friends who would raise an alarm within the day. He targeted the ones the city had already, in its own exhausted way, stopped fully counting. Destitute young women fresh off the trains with a bundle of belongings and no address to go to. Prostitutes working the streets near the station. Women the police of that era treated as disposable even when they were victims. Migrants from the East, with no German family in the capital to notice their silence. He offered them what the whole starving city wanted: work, a room, a meal. And because he had trained as a butcher, because his hands and his flat and his tools all had a plausible, ordinary purpose, nothing about him raised the alarm that it should have. What? To sit with these women for a moment, even though history left us almost none of their names, because that absence is itself the tragedy at the center of this case. They were somebody's daughters. They had gotten onto trains with whatever they could carry, chasing the same threadbare hope that drove half of defeated Germany that winter, the hope that the capital would have something for them that the ruined countryside did not. They had survived a war that killed millions. They had survived a collapse that broke an empire. And then they walked into a slum near a railway station and knocked on the door of a man who understood, better than almost anyone in the city, how completely invisible a hungry, homeless young woman had become. Picture the specific kind of arrival these women made, because it explains everything about why no alarm was ever raised in time. A young woman steps off a train at the Silesian station with a single case or a bundle tied in cloth. She has an address written on a scrap of paper, perhaps, an aunt's old lodging, a cousin's former employer, some thread of connection 3 years out of date in a city that has been rebuilt by chaos since anyone last wrote to her. Half the time the thread leads nowhere. The lodging has changed hands. The employer has fled west, or starved, or simply vanished into the general churn of the collapse. She is, within an hour of arriving in the capital, already a stranger with no fixed point. In a city of millions where the ordinary social nets, the neighbors who would ask after you, the family who would report you overdue, the employer who would wonder why you never started the position, do not yet exist for her, and may never come to exist at all. When a woman in that position disappeared, there was frequently no one left behind in Berlin to even notice the gap, and no one back in the shattered country she had come from with the means or the standing to demand an inquiry from a police force that had 100 more visible fires to put out. She could be erased, completely and cleanly, and the city would not so much as blink. If you find value in stories preserved this way, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you are listening from. Now, back to the record. What happened inside that squalid upstairs flat across roughly 3 years, from somewhere around 1918 into the summer of 1921, is a horror that the surviving record can only partly reconstruct, because Grossmann himself never gave the full confession that might have completed it. Women went up the private stairs to his rooms and did not come back down. He assaulted them, he killed them, and then, with the training of a man who had once earned his living at a butcher's block, he dismembered what remained. Some of what could not be used, he is believed to have carried out under cover of darkness and disposed of in the canals that thread through that part of the city, the Landwehr and the Luisenstedt, waterways that through those years gave up again and again fragments of women that the Berlin police could neither identify nor connect to any single suspect. A leg here, a torso there. Reports of dismembered remains in the canals became almost a grim regularity of the period, one more horror in a city already thick with them, and because the pieces surfaced separately in different stretches of water, months apart, no one drew the single dark line connecting them back to one address near the Silesian station. Try to picture the officers who actually pulled those fragments from the water, because they were not incompetent men, and that is the more unsettling truth of it. A city detective in 1920 Berlin was working a beat that had, in a single year, absorbed political assassinations, street fighting between armed factions, a currency in freefall, and a homicide rate that had climbed with the general collapse of order. A dismembered limb recovered from a canal was catalogued, examined by whatever forensic means the era possessed, which was slender at best, and then, when it could not be matched to any reported missing person, filed as unsolved. Multiply that single decision, reasonable and almost unavoidable in isolation, across 2 or 3 years and a dozen separate discoveries, and you have the precise mechanism by which one man was allowed to keep working. Not one catastrophic failure, a long chain of small, defensible ones, each of them individually forgivable, that added up to something the city would spend a century trying to account for. 'Cause here is where this case reaches past the merely horrifying and into the territory that has kept it alive in the public imagination for more than 100 years. And I want to be very careful with you about the difference between what is proven and what is legend, because the two have been tangled together in the telling of this story since the very week it broke. Grossmann sold meat, he ran a stand near the station, and in a starving city that had just watched a respected tradesman be arrested for a horror beyond speech, the rumor arrived almost instantly and spread faster than any denial could catch it, that the meat he had been selling, the cheap, plentiful, wonderfully affordable meat that had fed so many hungry Berliners through the worst of the shortage, had not all come from any animal. Stay with me through what comes next, because separating the proven from the legendary is exactly the kind of work I think this channel exists to do, and if that matters to you too, consider sharing this account with someone who would rather sit with an uncomfortable truth than a comfortable rumor. The plain fact is this: the claim that Karl Grossmann sold the flesh of his victims to unsuspecting customers as sausage and smoked meat was never proven. Not at his arrest, not in the investigation that followed, not in any surviving document that historians have been able to produce. It is one of the most repeated details in the entire case and one of the least verified. And yet it took hold immediately, and it has never let go. And I think that tells us something almost as important as the murders themselves. Think about what that rumor was doing for the people of Berlin the moment they heard it. The city had just been told that a butcher living quietly among them had spent years murdering the most vulnerable women who passed through its gates, and that the horror had gone entirely undetected the whole time. That alone was almost too much to sit with. But the rumor of the meat did something the murders alone could not. It reached backward and implicated everyone. It said that the horror had not stayed sealed inside one squalid flat. It said that ordinary Berliners, hungry and grateful and standing in an honest queue for an honest meal, might have unknowingly taken part in the crime themselves, might have carried a piece of one of those vanished women home in their own hands and eaten it at their own table. A city already reeling from war and starvation and collapse reached for the one story that could make its horror total, complete, inescapable, rather than confined to a single monstrous man behind a single door. Whether or not it was true, it was the story Berlin needed to tell about itself in that moment, and needing a story and having evidence for it are two very different things. On the 21st of August, 1921, the private terror behind that upstairs door finally reached the street. A neighbor, at last, heard something impossible to ignore, screams and heavy banging carrying down through the building in the middle of the day. This time somebody acted. The police were called, and when officers broke into the flat they found Karl Grossmann with blood on his hands, in the act of trying to take cyanide to end his own life before they could reach him. And in the room beyond him, on the bed, they found the body of a woman, freshly killed, bound in the manner, one officer would later say, of an animal trussed for slaughter. Consider the horror of that specific comparison, because it is not mine, it is the description left by the men who stood in that room, trussed like a hog for slaughter. The training that had once been an honest trade, the skill of a butcher's apprentice learned decades before in some ordinary shop, had been turned entirely inside out and pointed at a human being, and the officers who broke down that door saw, in an instant, exactly what that skill had become, weigh what it actually took to end this, not a detective's insight, not a pattern finally recognized in the Canal reports. Not even the belated attention of a police force, stretched thin by revolution and collapse. It took a single afternoon when Grossmann, for whatever reason, could not keep his latest victim quiet enough, and a single neighbor on a single ordinary day who happened to be close enough to hear it and troubled enough to act. Move that neighbor's schedule by an hour, put her out at the market instead of at home. And the flat above the stairs keeps its secret for another season, and the count of the missing climbs by however many more the coming winter would have allowed him. He was taken into custody, and Berlin, still hungry, still reeling, now had to reckon with the true scale of what had been living quietly near its busiest railway station for years. Estimates of how many women Grossmann killed have ranged wildly ever since. From a firmly evidenced handful, perhaps 3 women whose remains could be tied to the final period before his arrest, up to speculative figures as high as 50 across the full span of his years near the station. The wide range itself is a kind of confession about how badly this was investigated while it was happening. When a city cannot even agree, after the fact, whether a man killed 3 women or 50, it is telling you plainly that nobody was counting while it mattered. Sit with the arithmetic of that uncertainty for a moment, because it is doing real work in this story. 3 women is already an atrocity that deserves its own full reckoning, 3 separate families, 3 separate futures erased. 50 is a figure that belongs almost to the scale of a small massacre, spread quietly across 3 years by a single man, with a griddle and a butcher's training, and a city too broken to look up. The true number sits somewhere in that enormous gap, and it will very likely stay there permanently, because the one man who could have closed the distance between 3 and 50 chose, in the end, to take the answer with him rather than speak it aloud even once. Karl Grossmann never stood trial. He never gave the full accounting that might have settled the numbers, named the women, or confirmed, or finally killed the story of the meat. While awaiting the conclusion of the legal process against him, he took his own life in his cell, hanging himself, and with that final act of self-erasure, he ensured that his case would remain permanently unfinished. A horror the record can describe only in its edges, never in its whole. There is something almost fitting, in the coldest sense of that word, about a man who spent years erasing women without a trace, choosing, at the very end, to erase the truth about himself in exactly the same way. He gave the authorities a body in a room and a set of hands still wet with blood, and then he took back everything else, every name, every date, every answer to the question of how many, and he carried it all into a silence that a century of research has still not managed to break open. The court never got to ask him a single question under oath. The families of the missing, wherever they still existed, never got to hear him say a name they recognized. He decided, in that cell, that the world had earned only the crime scene and none of the explanation. And in a case already defined by absence, that final theft of the truth may be the most Grossmann thing he ever did. And Grossmann was not, as it turned out, an isolated horror. In the same defeated, starving Germany, in almost the very same years, other predators were doing versions of the same thing in other cities, exploiting the identical collapse of order and the identical flood of vulnerable, undocumented travelers. In Hanover, within a few years of Grossmann's arrest, a man named Fritz Hamann would be convicted of murdering more than 20 young men and boys drawn from that city's own railway station, in a case that carried its own rumors of meat sold on the black market. Later in the decade in Münsterberg, a man named Karl Denker would be found to have killed, and in his case, provably preserved and consumed the flesh of dozens of travelers who had stopped at his door for shelter. 3 separate men, 3 separate cities, 3 variations on the identical method, a railway station, a period of desperate strangers passing through, and a predator patient enough to let the chaos of the age do half his work for him. That is not coincidence. That is what a broken country looks like when it is examined closely enough, and Grossmann was simply the first of that particular generation of horrors to be caught. What does this case reveal about the world that made it possible? It reveals a city so thoroughly consumed by its own catastrophe that an entire category of women could go missing, one after another for years, without the disappearance of any single one of them ever rising to the level of an investigation that might have connected the pattern. Berlin in those years was drowning in genuine chaos, currency collapsing, food scarce, families broken by the war, a police force stretched past any reasonable capacity. In ordinary times, the vanishing of a young woman newly arrived by train might have drawn notice. In the Berlin of 1919 and 1920, it simply dissolved into the general catastrophe, one more absence in a city full of absences. Grossmann did not need to be clever to escape detection for years. He needed only to choose victims whom the wider world had already, through exhaustion and collapse, stopped fully seeing. That is the coldest fact in this entire case, colder even than the flat near the station. The predator did not slip past a functioning system. He walked through a gap that an entire broken society had left wide open, and he walked through it for years. And there is a second, quieter observation worth sitting with, about the rumor of the meat itself, because it says something about every age, not only his. When people are shown a horror too large to hold in an ordinary frame, they very often reach for a story that makes it larger still, rather than smaller, because a contained horror, oddly, can feel harder to bear than a limitless one. It is easier, in a strange way, to believe that an entire city was implicated in a monstrous crime than to sit with the plainer, and in some ways lonelier truth, that one man, working quietly behind one ordinary door, was horror enough all on his own, and that the rest of the city was guilty of nothing worse than looking away from women, it had already decided did not fully matter. Here is the question I want to leave with you, and I would like to know where you land on it in the comments. A legend has outlived the facts of this case for more than a century. The story of unknowing Berliners eating what should never have been sold to them. We cannot prove it, we equally cannot disprove it. Not fully, not after all this time and aftermath, who chose silence and then chose death rather than ever telling the whole truth. Does it matter, at this distance, whether that particular detail was ever real? Or has the rumor itself become its own kind of historical fact, a truer record of what an entire starving, frightened city was capable of believing about its own darkest year than any court transcript could ever have been? The Schlesischer Bahnhof does not stand under that name any longer. It was rebuilt and renamed in the decades since, folded into a different Berlin that has tried, in its own way, to leave the worst of the 20th century behind it. The slums that once clustered around it are gone. The stand where a heavy-set man once sold cheap meat to a grateful, hungry queue has left no trace at all, not even a plaque, not even a footnote. Most Berliners passing through that part of the city today have ever read. The record that remains is fragmented and incomplete by design, because the one man who could have completed it chose a cell and a length of rope over a courtroom and a confession. What is certain is smaller than the legend, and still entirely sufficient to horrify. A butcher's apprentice who became in a starving and broken city a predator that a fractured society could not or would not see. A flat near a railway station where an unknown number of women, whose names the record never properly kept, went up a private staircase and did not come down. We do not know how many. We do not know most of their names. We do not know, and now never can know, whether the meat sold beside that hissing griddle ever truly contained what the legend insists it did. What we do know is this: in the space of roughly 3 years, in one of the great capitals of Europe, an unknown number of young women arrived by train, hoping for work and a future, and vanished so completely and so quietly that a city already numb with catastrophe did not register their absence as a pattern until a single neighbor, on a single afternoon in August, happened to be standing close enough to hear a sound she could not ignore. Everything before that afternoon belongs to the women themselves, women whose names the era did not think important enough to preserve, and everything after it belongs to a legend that Berlin has never quite managed to let go of. Somewhere between those two things, in the silence the record cannot fill, is the true and unrecoverable shape of what actually happened to each of them, and a queue of ordinary, hungry Berliners standing in the cold outside a smoking griddle who never knew, and to this day can never entirely be told, exactly what it was they were being fed.